Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. Chapter 1. The Stranger Under the Willow. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting an amber glow across the lake as the city buzzed faintly in the distance. Sophia leaned against the trunk of an ancient willow tree, her worn sketchbook balanced on her knees. She drew furiously, her pencil darting over the page, trying to capture the moment before it vanished into night. Her art had always been a refuge, a place where silence spoke louder than words. She was used to solitude. She preferred it, even. But tonight, something in the air felt off-kilter. A shadow fell across her page, disrupting the smooth strokes of her pencil. She glanced up, startled, to find a man standing a few feet away, partially obscured by the cascading branches of the willow. "Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt," he said, his voice deep and tinged with a slight accent she couldn't quite place. Sophia blinked, unsure whether to feel alarmed or annoyed. The stranger wore a long coat that looked too warm for the balmy evening, and his disheveled hair caught the fading sunlight in a halo of gold. His hands were stuffed into his pockets, as if he were unsure what to do with them. "It's fine," she replied curtly, her pencil poised to resume its work. "You draw beautifully," he said, nodding at the sketchbook. "May I see?" Sophia hesitated. Strangers didn't usually approach her. In fact, people rarely noticed her at all, especially when she melted into the shadows to draw. But there was something about the man, an unsettling mix of vulnerability and intensity, that made her hold out the sketchbook without speaking. He studied it with the reverence of someone admiring a sacred text. "You've captured the way the light kisses the water. It's alive. You don't just see the world. You feel it." Sophia's cheeks flushed. "Thanks, I didn't catch your name." "Elias," he said, meeting her gaze. His eyes were a startling shade of gray, like the sky before a storm. Sophia nodded. "I'm Sophia." Elias smiled faintly, his expression both warm and unreadable. "Do you come here often?" "I like the quiet," she said, closing her sketchbook. "It's inspiring." For a moment they stood in silence, the distant hum of the city blending with the gentle rustle of the willow's leaves. "I used to come here as a boy," Elias said suddenly, his voice soft. "This tree was smaller then. It's funny how things grow when you're not looking." Sophia tilted her head, intrigued despite herself. "You're from here?" "Not anymore," he replied, his smile fading. "I've been away for a long time. Too long, maybe." She wanted to ask more, but something in his tone made her hold back. Instead, she said, "What brought you back?" Elias hesitated, his gaze shifting to the horizon. "A promise," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Before she could press further, he turned to leave, disappearing into the twilight as suddenly as he had appeared. Sophia sat there for a long time after he was gone, her sketchbook forgotten. There was a strange weight to their encounter, as though she'd stumbled into the first page of a story she wasn't meant to read. But that night, when she flipped through her sketches, she froze. In the margins of the page, a space she had left blank, was a hastily drawn image of a willow tree. Beneath it, in an unfamiliar hand, were the words, "We'll meet again, Sophia, when the time is right." Her heart raced as she stared at the message. She hadn't seen Elias write anything, nor had she handed him her pencil. For the first time in years, Sophia felt the spark of something she couldn't explain. A mystery that began under a willow tree and seemed destined to change everything. Chapter 2. Whispers of the Past. Sophia couldn't shake the encounter. The message in her sketchbook haunted her thoughts as she wandered through her days. She scrutinized the handwriting again and again, its delicate slant seeming both familiar and foreign. Was it a trick? Some elaborate prank? Her life, ordinarily predictable, now felt charged with an electric undercurrent. Even her art seemed to change. Her sketches grew bolder, her lines more confident, as though her hands were moving to an invisible rhythm she didn't fully understand. By the weekend, she found herself drawn back to the willow tree. The lake was quiet, save for the occasional ripple of fish breaking the surface. She set up her sketchbook on the same patch of grass and waited. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, then began its slow descent. Elias didn't come. Disappointed, but not surprised, she started packing her things when a rustling sound made her freeze. She turned sharply to see a small envelope nestled at the base of the willow, partially obscured by its gnarled roots. Sophia approached cautiously. The envelope was plain, save for her name scrawled across the front in the same handwriting as the note in her sketchbook. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single page, folded carefully. Sophia, there are moments in life that shape us, even when we don't realize it. You are standing on the edge of such a moment. If you want to understand, meet me at the old clock tower tomorrow at sunset. Bring the sketchbook. Her heart pounded. The old clock tower had been abandoned for years, its crumbling facade a stark reminder of time's indifference. She'd passed it often, but never ventured inside. The idea of meeting Elias there both thrilled and unnerved her. The next day, as the sun dipped low, Sophia stood at the base of the clock tower, clutching her sketchbook. The structure loomed above her, its once proud spire now weathered and cracked. The heavy wooden door creaked open at her touch. Inside, the air was cool and musty, filled with the faint scent of mildew. Dust motes danced in the fading light streaming through shattered stained glass windows. "Elias?" she called out, her voice echoing. "Up here," came the reply. She followed the sound of his voice, ascending a spiral staircase that wound precariously upward. At the top, she found him standing beside the clock's massive gears, his back to her. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Elias said without turning around. Sophia clutched her sketchbook tighter. "I almost didn't." He turned to face her then, and she noticed something strange. The same intensity in his eyes as before, but now tinged with something else, regret perhaps, or fear. "Why are we here?" she asked. "Because the past has a way of catching up to us," Elias said cryptically. He gestured to her sketchbook. "Open it." She obeyed, flipping through the pages until she reached the spot where she'd found the first message. But the margins were no longer blank. Instead, a new image had appeared, a detailed drawing of the clock tower, its gears meticulously rendered. Sophia gasped. "I didn't draw this." "I know," Elias said. She looked up at him, her breath catching. "Then who did?" "The same person who's been trying to warn us," he said, stepping closer. "You." Sophia's head spun. "What are you talking about? I've never—" Elias interrupted her, his voice firm. "You have. Or rather, you will. Time isn't as linear as we like to believe. Sometimes it bends, creating echoes, messages, pieces of the future bleeding into the present." Sophia stared at him, incredulous. "You're saying I'm drawing these from the future?" "Yes," Elias said simply. "And if we don't figure out why, something terrible is going to happen." Her skepticism faltered under the weight of his conviction. "How do you know all this?" Elias hesitated, his expression darkening. "Because I've been through it before, with you." The room seemed to tilt around her. "That's impossible. I've never met you before yesterday." "Not in this timeline," Elias said softly. Sophia felt as though the ground was slipping out from under her. "I don't understand." "You will," he said. "But for now, we need to find the next message. And we don't have much time." The gears of the clock above them groaned to life, their deep, resonant chime echoing through the tower. Sophia's world had just become infinitely stranger, and she had a feeling it was only the beginning. Chapter 3. The Tides of Memory. The heavy chime of the clock reverberated through Sophia's chest, each strike feeling like a countdown to something she couldn't name. Elias stood still, his expression unreadable, as he watched her grapple with the enormity of his revelation. "I don't understand," Sophia repeated, her voice trembling. How can we already have lived this? How is any of this possible?" Elias leaned against the railing, the dying light painting his face in hues of amber and shadow. "Time doesn't work the way we think it does. It's not a straight line. It loops, twists, and folds over itself. Some people, rare people, become sensitive to those folds. You're one of them, Sophia." She shook her head, pacing in the cramped space. "But I'm just an artist. I sit by lakes and sketch trees. I'm not." "Not what?" Elias interrupted. "Special? Important? You are. And that's why you've been leaving these messages, for yourself, for us, to stop what's coming." She stopped pacing and faced him, her fingers gripping the edges of her sketchbook. "What's coming?" For the first time, Elias looked away, his shoulders sagging under the weight of something unseen. "I don't know exactly," he admitted. "I only know it's connected to the lake, to this clock tower, and to me." Sophia frowned. "To you," Elias nodded. "In the first timeline, He hesitated, struggling to find the words. I didn't make it, and whatever happened after that, it wasn't good. Sophia's chest tightened. The sincerity in his voice was unnerving. She wanted to dismiss it all as nonsense, to walk away and return to her normal, predictable life. But something deep inside her, something she couldn't name, urged her to stay. Let's say I believe you, she said finally. What do we do now? Elias's gaze softened, a flicker of relief passing through his features. We look for the next message. You've already left clues for yourself. We just need to find them. Sophia nodded, though her mind still spun with questions. She flipped through her sketchbook again, examining each page with a new sense of urgency. The drawings seemed ordinary, landscapes, portraits, studies of light and shadow, but as she reached the last page, she froze. There, in the corner, was a tiny detail she hadn't noticed before. A series of numbers etched into the bark of the willow tree she'd drawn. 34.455 degrees N, 118.7556 degrees W. Coordinates, she murmured, tracing the numbers with her finger. Elias leaned over her shoulder, his breath warm against her ear. That's near the cliffs, he said. By the ocean. Sophia's heart quickened. She'd been to the cliffs once, years ago, but she couldn't imagine why she or her future self would have chosen that spot. When do we go? She asked. Now, Elias said. We can't wait. The drive to the cliffs was tense and silent, the city lights fading into darkness as they neared the coast. The sound of crashing waves greeted them as they stepped out of the car, the salty air sharp and bracing. Sophia clutched her sketchbook tightly as they followed the coordinates, guided by the faint glow of her phone's screen. The path was uneven, overgrown with weeds and gnarled roots, but eventually, they arrived at the edge of the cliffs. This is it, Elias said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the ocean. Sophia scanned the area, her eyes straining in the dim light. There was nothing unusual, just rocks, sand, and the endless expanse of water. And then she saw it. Nestled between two boulders was a small wooden box, weathered and stained by years of exposure to the elements. She hesitated before picking it up, her fingers trembling as she opened the lid. Inside was a single key, rusted but intact, and a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully, her breath catching as she read the words written in her own handwriting. When the clock strikes 12, the truth will be revealed. The key opens the door to the past. Use it wisely. Sophia looked up at Elias, her heart pounding. What door? He shook his head, his expression unreadable. I don't know, but we need to find it, before it finds us. Sophia stared at the key, its cold metal pressing against her palm. For the first time, she understood the gravity of what they were facing. And as the waves crashed below, she realized there was no turning back. Chapter 4. The Door Beneath the Lake. The ride back from the cliffs was charged with unspoken tension. Sophia clutched the rusted key in her hand, its jagged edges biting into her palm, as if to remind her this was real. The words on the note repeated in her mind like a mantra. The key opens the door to the past. Use it wisely. The problem was, she had no idea what door it referred to. Back at her apartment, Sophia spread her sketchbook, the note, and the key across her small kitchen table. Elias stood nearby, his hands shoved into his coat pockets, his gray eyes dark with thought. The clock strikes 12, she murmured, staring at the note. It must mean midnight, right? But where's the door? Elias leaned forward, tracing the outline of the key with his finger. If the note is right, and it usually is, it's not just any door. It's tied to the past. Somewhere important to you, to us, to all of this. Sophia frowned. The lake, she said suddenly. Elias straightened. Why the lake? The willow tree, the sketches, the coordinates, they all lead back to the lake, she said. That's where I first met you, where this all started. Elias nodded slowly. It makes sense. But what kind of door would be at the lake? Sophia didn't have an answer, but the certainty in her gut told her that was where they needed to go. They arrived at the lake just as the moon reached its peak, casting a silvery glow over the still water. The willow tree stood like a sentinel, its branches swaying gently in the night breeze. Sophia's heart raced as they approached the tree, the soft crunch of grass underfoot the only sound. She knelt by the roots, searching for anything that might resemble a door. Elias joined her, his movements deliberate as he examined the gnarled bark. "There's nothing here," he said after a moment, his voice tinged with frustration. Sophia bit her lip, her mind racing. The note had to mean something. She pulled out her sketchbook and flipped to the page with the willow tree. As she studied it, she noticed a faint outline she hadn't seen before, a rectangular shape, almost imperceptible, drawn into the roots. "It's here," she whispered, pressing her fingers to the spot on the tree where the outline appeared in her drawing. Nothing happened. Elias crouched beside her. "Wait," he said, his hand brushing against the key in her pocket. "The key." Sophia hesitated, then pulled the key out and held it to the bark. To her astonishment, the bark softened under her touch, the ancient wood rippling like water. A faint outline of a keyhole appeared, glowing softly in the moonlight. "Try it," Elias urged. Sophia's hand shook as she inserted the key into the tree. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low groan, the roots shifted, pulling apart to reveal a dark opening in the earth. A faint, ethereal light glowed from within, beckoning them forward. Elias grabbed her arm. "We don't know what's down there." Sophia looked at him, her pulse thundering in her ears. "We don't have a choice." Without another word, she stepped into the opening, Elias close behind her. The tunnel beneath the tree was narrow and damp, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay. The faint light guided them deeper, illuminating carvings on the walls, symbols and images that seemed ancient and yet oddly familiar. Sophia's gaze lingered on one carving in particular, a figure holding a sketchbook, standing before a clock tower. Her breath caught. "It's me," she whispered. Elias followed her gaze, his expression grim. "This place, it's a record of everything that's happened, or will happen." They continued walking until the tunnel opened into a cavern. At its center was a door, unlike anything Sophia had ever seen. It was made of smooth obsidian, its surface etched with swirling patterns that seemed to shift and move under the dim light. The note's words echoed in her mind. "The key opens the door to the past." "This is it," Elias said, his voice hushed. "This is where it all begins." Sophia stepped closer, the key in her hand once more. As she approached, the patterns on the door pulsed with light, growing brighter with each step. Elias reached for her arm. "Sophia, wait! Before you open it, are you sure you're ready for what's on the other side?" She turned to him, her expression resolute. "No, but if this door holds the answers, we have to go through it." Elias nodded, releasing her arm. Sophia took a deep breath and inserted the key into the door. The obsidian surface shimmered, then began to dissolve like mist. Beyond the door was a swirling void of light and shadow, a kaleidoscope of moments suspended in time. Images flashed before her, herself as a child sitting by the lake, Elias standing in the clock tower, his face etched with sorrow, the willow tree burning under a crimson sky. Elias stepped beside her, his gaze fixed on the swirling chaos. "This isn't just the past," he murmured. "It's everything." Sophia reached out, her fingers brushing against the edge of the void. The world around her seemed to tilt, and suddenly she was falling through time, through memories, through everything she had ever known. And then there was nothing but light. Chapter 5, Fractured Timeline. The light was blinding, enveloping Sophia in a cocoon of warmth and chaos. She had no sense of direction, no up or down, only the sensation of being pulled through layers of time and memory. Fragments of her life flashed past her like pieces of a shattered mirror. Her mother's laughter, the scent of her childhood home, the first time she touched a sketchbook. But there were other images, too, things she didn't recognize. A burning clock tower. A crowd of faceless figures, their voices a deafening roar. Elias standing alone in the rain, blood on his hands. The cacophony stopped as abruptly as it had begun. Sophia landed with a jolt, her knees hitting cool, damp grass. She gasped, her lungs burning as though she'd been underwater. Slowly she opened her eyes. She was standing in a field under a twilight sky, the air heavy with the scent of rain. In the distance, the lake shimmered like glass, and the willow tree stood tall, its branches reaching toward the heavens. But something was wrong. The willow was younger, its trunk thinner, its leaves brighter. The landscape around her was familiar yet alien, as if she were looking at a version of the world from long ago. Elias landed beside her, his arrival quieter but no less disoriented. He pushed himself to his feet, scanning their surroundings with wide eyes. This isn't where we were," he said. Sophia turned to him, clutching her sketchbook to her chest. Where are we? Elias hesitated, his jaw tightening. Not where, he said. When? Sophia's stomach dropped. You mean we've traveled through time? He nodded grimly. I think this is the past. Look at the willow. It's younger. This place feels older. Sophia turned back to the tree, her thoughts racing. If this was the past, what were they meant to do here? Why had the door brought them to this moment? As if in answer, a voice called out from behind them. You shouldn't be here. Sophia and Elias spun around. Standing a few feet away was a woman, her features sharp and familiar, her eyes a striking mirror of Sophia's own. She was dressed in simple clothes, too simple, like something from another era, and held a staff in one hand. Sophia stared, her breath catching. Who are you? The woman tilted her head, her expression unreadable. I could ask you the same question, but I already know the answer. She stepped closer, her gaze locked on Sophia. You're me. Sophia's knees nearly buckled. That's impossible. The woman, her future self, smiled faintly. Is it? You've already seen what time can do. Why should this surprise you? Elias stepped forward, his tone wary. If you're her, then you know why we're here. The older Sophia turned her attention to him, her eyes narrowing. I do, but the question is, do you? Sophia found her voice, though it wavered. We're trying to stop something terrible. The older Sophia sighed, her shoulders slumping. You're right. Something terrible is coming. Something that has already happened in your time. The door brought you here because this is where it began. She gestured to the lake and the willow tree. This place isn't just a location. It's an anchor. It connects all the timelines. Elias frowned. What do you mean, anchor? The older Sophia's expression darkened. Every moment in time is tied to another. The lake, the tree, the clock tower, they're points where the fabric of time is weaker, where events bleed through and ripple outward. If those points are disrupted. She trailed off, her eyes distant. Sophia stepped closer, her heart pounding. Disrupted how? The older version of herself looked at her with a sadness so profound it made her chest ache. You'll see soon enough. Before Sophia could ask more, the air around them shifted, growing heavier. The ground trembled, and the sky darkened, as if a storm were brewing. The older Sophia's expression turned urgent. It's coming. You need to leave. Elias grabbed her arm. Wait, what's coming? What are we supposed to do? The older Sophia ignored him, focusing on her younger self. Sophia, listen to me. You have to protect the anchors. If they're destroyed, the timelines will collapse and everyone, will cease to exist. But how? Sophia pleaded, panic rising in her chest. The older Sophia placed a hand on her shoulder, her grip firm. You'll know when the time comes. Trust your instincts. Trust him. She glanced at Elias, her expression softening. And don't let fear control you. The trembling intensified, and the light around them began to fracture, splintering into shards like broken glass. Sophia reached out, but her older self was already fading, her voice echoing through the chaos. Protect the anchors, Sophia. Protect them. And then the world shattered. Sophia woke with a gasp, her body drenched in sweat. She was back by the lake, the willow tree towering over her, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. Elias was beside her, stirring groggily. What just happened? She asked, her voice hoarse. Elias sat up, his face pale. I think we were shown the beginning, the first fracture. Sophia's hands trembled as she opened her sketchbook. On the first page was a new drawing, the lake, the willow tree, and a shadowy figure standing between them, its face obscured. Beneath it were 3 words. The first anchor. Sophia Mez, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. We have to protect this place. Elias nodded, his jaw set. And we need to find the other anchors, before it's too late. Final chapter. The lake shimmered under the morning sun, a tranquil facade masking the growing storm beneath. Sophia and Elias stood by the willow tree, the sketchbook open between them, its pages now filled with cryptic drawings and phrases that hadn't been there before. Each page marked the location of an anchor, and each drawing grew darker, the images more foreboding. 5 anchors in total. The lake was the first. They'd managed to protect it, fending off a distortion that had appeared as a shadowy rift threatening to swallow the willow whole. But the battle had left them both drained, and there were still 4 more to find. The sketchbook's latest page displayed a stark image. The clock tower, its spire cracked, its face frozen at 12. Beneath it, the words, "The last anchor. The final choice." "We need to go back to the clock tower," Elias said, his voice low. Sophia nodded, gripping the sketchbook tightly. "I don't know if I'm ready for what we'll find there." "You don't have to be ready," Elias replied. "We just have to act." The clock tower loomed over the city, its shadow long and imposing. Sophia and Elias stood at its base, the key from the willow tree now tucked into Sophia's pocket. The door at the tower's entrance was ajar, creaking softly in the breeze, as if inviting them in. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint ticking of unseen gears. The climb to the top was grueling, each step on the spiral staircase steep and worn. By the time they reached the bell chamber, their breaths were labored, their resolve shaken. The room was bathed in an eerie light that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a heartbeat. At its center stood a figure cloaked in shadow, its form shifting and indistinct. The moment they stepped inside, the figure turned toward them, and Sophia felt a wave of cold seep into her bones. "You're too late," the figure said, its voice a cacophony of tones, as if it spoke from every moment in time at once. Sophia stepped forward, her hand trembling as she held up the sketchbook. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure's form solidified slightly, and for a brief moment, Sophia saw her own face staring back at her. "I am what you will become if you fail," it said. "I am the collapse of the anchors, the unraveling of time, and I cannot let you stop me." Sophia's chest tightened. "If you're me, then you know I'll fight." The figure laughed, a hollow, echoing sound. "And that is why you will fail. You are bound by fear, by doubt. You cling to Elias as if he can save you, but he can't." Sophia glanced at Elias, whose jaw was tight with determination. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steady. "We're stronger together." The shadow figure lunged toward them, the room erupting in chaos. The walls of the tower began to shift and dissolve, revealing glimpses of other timelines, fractured moments where the anchors had fallen, leaving devastation in their wake. Sophia and Elias moved as one, dodging the figure's attacks while searching for the anchor. The sketchbook glowed faintly in Sophia's hands, guiding her toward the center of the room. "There!" Elias shouted, pointing to the clock's mechanism. At its core was a glowing sphere, pulsing with light. The last anchor. Sophia ran toward it, but the shadow figure blocked her path, its form expanding to fill the room. "You think you can fix this?" it hissed. "You think you can save him?" Sophia froze. "Save who?" The figure's form shifted again, revealing Elias lying motionless, his eyes closed. The vision struck Sophia like a physical blow. "It doesn't have to end like this," the figure said, its tone almost pleading. "If you leave the anchors, if you let time collapse, you can rewrite everything. Save everyone you've lost." Sophia hesitated, the weight of the decision crushing her. The figure's words echoed in her mind, tempting her with promises of a world without pain, without loss. But then she felt Elias's hand on her shoulder. "Sophia," he said softly, "don't listen to it. It's not real." She looked at him, his presence grounding her, and she knew he was right. The anchors weren't just about her, they were about preserving everything. With a cry, Sophia leapt forward, the key in her hand. She plunged it into the mechanism, and the sphere's light exploded, filling the room with brilliance. The shadow figure screamed, its form dissolving into nothingness. The tower shuddered, but the light held steady, stabilizing the room as the fractures in time began to mend. When the light faded, Sophia and Elias were back by the lake. The willow tree stood strong, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. Sophia opened the sketchbook, expecting to see more instructions, but the pages were blank. The anchors were safe, the timelines were whole. Elias stood beside her, his hand brushing against hers. "You did it," he said. "No," Sophia replied, her gaze fixed on the tree. "We did it." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she let herself breathe. But deep in her heart, she knew the fight wasn't over. The anchors were safe, for now. But time was fragile, and its guardians would always be needed. As she and Elias walked away from the lake, hand in hand, Sophia made a silent vow. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And this time, they would be ready.